So it is my pleasure to introduce Nancy Cohen Israel. She's an independent art historian, art educator, writer, and curator. She's a regular lecturer here at the Meadows Museum, and she's taught at colleges and museums throughout the area. She's a regular contributor to Patron Magazine, and she writes primarily about the visual arts. She's also contributed to numerous local and national publications. She has an MA in art history from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where she focused on Renaissance painting. And her career has spanned the art world, including positions such as the exhibition coordinator at the Trust for Museum Exhibitions in Washington, D.C. She was a McDermott Fellow in education at the Dallas Museum of Art, the director of the Edith Baker Gallery, and I'm pleased to say that she has very recently joined the Meadows Museum as the manager of our docent program. So it's my pleasure now to turn the presentation over to Nancy Cohen Israel.
Great, thank you, Anne, and thank you again to all of you for joining us today for, as Anne said, our last learning of lunch of 2020. Today we're going to be looking at a pair of portraits. I'll go ahead and share my screen with you, that we have in the Meadows Museum collection of the Archdukes Albert and Isabella. And you know, these two first of all, to have these pendant portraits, there were a number of these portraits done of the two of them, but they're not all together. So to have this pair is really fortuitous for us. They are early acquisitions to the Meadows Museum collection, acquired by Mr. Meadows himself. I first encountered Isabella Clara Eugenia when I was in graduate school, and I was writing a paper about the Ildefonsus altarpiece that she commissioned Peter Paul Rubens to do. And when I came home, I was at George Washington University. I came home, went to the Meadows, and there she was. So I feel like she's sort of a lifelong friend. And to be able to talk about her today and talk about her clothing really gives me a great deal of pleasure. So let's go ahead and jump in. So here are portraits of the Archdukes as they are collectively known. Archduke Albert of Austria, and the Archduchess Isabella Clara Eugenia, the Infanta of Spain. This was painted in 1600, shortly after they got married and shortly after they arrived in the Netherlands. And one of the things we're going to look at is how their clothes tell the story of this position in the Netherlands. Isabella was the daughter of Philip II, seen here on the left, in a portrait by Titian, one of many, many portraits that Titian did for the royal family, and Isabella Valois, seen here on the right. And the one on the right was painted by Sofonisba Anguissola, who was a lady in waiting to Isabel, or Elizabeth of Valois. She was also Isabella Clara Eugenia's painting instructor, an art teacher, along with her sister. So she had a tremendously important role at the court. Here is mother and child. I know it doesn't look particularly maternal, but Elizabeth of Valois with Isabella Clara Eugenia. She's about 2 years old here, which means she has already been betrothed to be married, which is an interesting story we'll get into. One thing here that might not really catch your attention, but is significant as far as clothing in the 16th century goes, is this handkerchief that Elizabeth of Valois holds in her right hand. Having a handkerchief was a relatively new phenomenon in the 16th century, and it represented cleanliness, physically and morally and spiritually. And it represented a tremendous amount of wealth, because think of it, if you could afford to have just this big square cloth to just hold on to or just to show, it signified you had quite a bit of money. What we're going to see as we go through is how these cloths get embellished. And we see that starting here of this double portrait of Isabella and her sister, Carmen Michaela, by Alonso Sanchez Coello, who was the court artist sort of after Antonis More. So Antonis More, who was a Flemish painter who went to the Spanish court, who set the precedent for painting, and we'll see one of his paintings a little later on, then sort of passed the baton on to Sanchez Coello, whose work you see here, who passed it on to Pantoja de la Cruz, who did our two portraits, who then sort of passed it along to Velázquez. And that will all make more sense, I hope, as we go along. But here we see Isabella Clara Eugenia, as I mentioned, in the foreground on the left side, holding her handkerchief early in life at the age of 9. And she was always destined for great things. She was always being groomed to really rule in her own capacity. She was fluent in Dutch, French, and Italian, of course, as well as her native Spanish. And so she was prepared for whatever eventuality that came her way. Here we see her in another portrait by Sanchez Coelho. This one done in the early 1580s. And we know it's the early 1580s because you can see that she's wearing her Portuguese court dress. And in 1580, her father, Philip II, went to Portugal to ascend that throne. And so Philip's parents were Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Isabella of Portugal, through whom he inherited the Portuguese throne. And Isabella Clara Eugenia's maternal grandparents, so Isabella Vela's grandparents, were Henry II of France and Catherine de' Medici. And so here she sort of embodies these two great noble houses. And we see this in her clothing, not only of the Portuguese court, but everything else poured into it. You've got the court of Philip II. She's holding this wonderful little cameo here. You've got this little pillbox hat here, which is very much a French emblem. And she is quite literally dripping with gemstones. And the purpose for this was to show that she was the embodiment of Habsburg Spain and Habsburg wealth. And what's fascinating to note is that while all of these treasures from what was called in the Orient, but from the East, we'll say, from Asia, from the Middle East, always went from East to West. Well, through Habsburg might, and now with the addition of Portugal, it meant that there was a direct line from the New World straight to Spain, straight to Portugal. And you can see these wonderful details. You've got white silk here, and the embroidery is gold thread. So quite costly, these wonderful silk ribbons tying her dress together, and then all of these rings and jewels. If we continue, we can see this gorgeous detail in the plumage of her hat. And then there are a few elements that we will see over and over again. And one is this pendant, which has come to us through the ages to be known as La Perla Peregrina. It's sort of the wandering pearl. And in fact, that name was only given to it in the 19th century. At this point, it's still relatively new in the Habsburg family. Now, Isabella has three great big letdowns in her life. The first one is that the vacancy came to rule the French throne, and her father sort of vied for it for her. When her grandfather died, Henry II, her uncle took over the throne, Henry III. He was assassinated in 1589, and so Philip said, you know what, it's my daughter's turn. She needs to sit on the French throne. And the French said, absolutely not. And you can't really blame them, because in fact, the first half of the 16th century was ruled by only three men: Henry VIII in England, Francis I in France, and Charles V in Spain. And Henry and Francis both died in 1547. Charles, on the other hand, hung on, and he abdicated in 1555. And when he did, he broke his empire apart. So on the one hand, you had all of Europe that was ruled by the Spanish Habsburgs, which was a lot: Spain, Portugal, the whole New World, the two Sicilies, etc. And so he gave that to his son, Philip II. And then the Holy Roman Empire, which was basically other from France and England, Germany, Austria, etc., Charles gave to his brother, Ferdinand. So I hope you're all still with me, because I know this is a lot of lineage and a lot of people. But these earlier men all ruled for 30 to 40 years. So the French were like, we really just need some change of blood. We don't want Habsburgs running all of Europe, which would have happened if Isabella had sat on that throne. So with that pathway closed, Philip thought, well, at least she's still betrothed to Rudolph II, who was the grandson of Ferdinand. So he inherited the Holy Roman Empire. So Philip probably thought, well, at least if we can have her marry her cousin, the Habsburg Empire will remain whole, and she will still retain all of the Spanish lands, and through marriage, all of these Eastern countries as well. Perfect. And here you've got this portrait, again by Sanchez Coelho, on the left of this young Rudolph II, to whom she was betrothed. This was painted in 1567, so right after this betrothal came through, and the young Isabella would have had this portrait to look at her whole life of her intended. Well, 20 years later, this intended, Rudolph II, declared he wasn't getting married to anybody. He didn't care for women. He was gay, actually, and he just decided that he didn't need to get married to anyone, which really dashed Philip's dreams for his daughter. And at this point, she was 22 years old, which is already quite old in the life of European monarchy. And Philip said, okay, at least, thank goodness, Rudolph has a brother, Albert VII, Archduke of Austria. Small glitch there was that he was already an archbishop. He was the Archbishop of Toledo. And the deal that Philip made to Isabella, who of course had no say in any of this, was, I will give you the Spanish Netherlands, so the Low Countries, on the condition that you marry Albert, the Archbishop. And she really had no choice. So she, of course, said yes. They needed papal dispensation to relieve him of his church duties. Fortunately, Clement VII was the Pope and a friend of the Habsburgs. And so finally, Isabella is able to wed. At this point, she is 33 years old, which again is positively ancient for these rulers. And tragically, her father does not live to see her married. So he dies 7 months prior. She takes care of him. She is his primary caregiver for the last 3 years of his life, even though he is married to Anna of Austria at this point. And she does a lot of work with him. She translates all of his Italian. So they're very close. And the one other thing I should interject at this point is that, we tend to think of these rulers as only wanting sons. And for all of the bad things that we've heard about Philip II through the years, about how he was this dark spider holed up in the Escorial, etc., he was thrilled when he had a daughter. And so he was a very loving and doting father to Isabella and her sister, which is very interesting, particularly in this time. He already had an heir because he had been married. First time he was married was to Maria Manuela of Portugal, with whom he had Carlos, who was Prince of Asturias. Unfortunately, Carlos did not live a long life and he died before he could succeed his father. His second wife, whom we'll see momentarily, is Mary Tudor of England. She died without issue. Third wife is Elizabeth of Valois, and she gives birth to Isabella and her sister Carmen. And then he has one more wife, Anna of Austria, with whom he has Philip III. So we've got Isabella married off. Here is a portrait done quite a bit later, 1615, of her with her husband, Albert of Austria. And here you can see she's already donned sort of this Habsburg eagle in her hair and on her dress. And here they are already very much in full flush of ruling the Spanish Netherlands. Now, what's interesting, once again, you see this handkerchief, but this is not just a plain handkerchief. As you can see, it's encrusted with lace. So what we're going to look at today is the lace making industry that really took off in Flanders at this time in the early 16th or mid 16th, early 17th century. Interestingly enough, it was Charles V, Isabella's grandfather, who dictated that all girls in convent schools learn lace making. But at that time, it was only being done for the church. And I think it's interesting, Jean-Paul Gaultier had thought he was doing something crazy new when he started bringing in all this liturgical clothing. Well, it was done in the 16th century that eventually lace became a fashion accessory for more than just members of the church. And it's really helped along by the Archdukes for a number of reasons that we will be talking about. The other thing is that some of these handkerchiefs that Isabella, Clara, Eugenia own were actually woven from pineapple fiber, which came from the Philippines. So again, she really spreaded this idea of local everywhere. And it's interesting to note that these handkerchiefs were so valuable that they were considered part of a dowry, and a very important part of one. And here you get a sense of an early contemporaneous handkerchief that's just covered with this gorgeous, gorgeous lace. So we are learning at lunch. We have to have something to go with it. As Isabella and Albert enter enter Brussels, we've got the fusion of these two great cultures. So Jules be damned, what's one of the best things that the Spanish bring to Belgium? Chocolate. And what's one of the best things that the Belgians can bring to chocolate? Dairy. And so here you've got this, what looks like a phenomenal Belgian hot chocolate recipe that I think Anne will probably go ahead and put in the chat. I haven't made it yet, but it's kind of a gray, dreary day here in Dallas. Perfect afternoon for hot chocolate. So we'll all have to try it, and you'll let me know what you think. Here's another portrait of Isabella, this time by Franz Porvis. Now, important to know, and I will probably be saying this 1,000,001 times, that they supported local artists, local artisans, local craftsmen wherever they could. And this marks an enormous shift from the Spanish court, because the Spanish court in Spain is not supporting local by and large. They're importing artists from Flanders, from Italy, from Northern Netherlands, from what's now Holland. And so for them to say, we're here and we want to be a part of this community is quite large. This was painted in 1599. So right when Isabella and Albert get married, there is a detail that lets us know this may have had an association with marriage. And that is, you will see this dress is covered in these little flowers that in European art come to us as a pink. We know them as a dianthus. Dianthus means flower of God. And they sort of have a double entendre here, because in Dutch, it's known, the flower is known as a nagelbloem, a nail flower. So they were reminiscent of the nails that were used to crucify Christ. And so here you've got this idea of a new bride, as well as a Catholic bride. So this idea of the church is never far removed from these portraits. In this portrait, I know it looks almost like the one of Isabella and her mother, but we had in this one, as well as in the prior one, a dwarf next to Isabella, one of these little people who are ubiquitous at court. And here she's wearing this spectacular cloak that is lined in fur, as you see all the way going down, covering another dress, all done in this grayish white silk with gold embroidery, lace wristlets, and this insane lace ruff, and we'll talk more about those soon. And then you've got these elements that we'll see over and over again, and that are also in our painting, this string of pearls, this cross here, and then this pearl that we saw previously. Now this painting, so what they did was Isabella and Albert came and immediately set about trying to be peacemakers. And this was actually given as a gift to Anne of Denmark by Isabella. She was married to James I of England. And, you know, they had a mutual enemy in Queen Elizabeth I of England. And so she set up these diplomatic channels, in this case, using art. And it was presented by the ambassador of the Spanish Netherlands, Charles de Leyne, to Anne in 1603. There was actually a companion piece of Albert, which of course is lost to us now. Now, the other thing that lets us know that this was part of her Netherlandish outfit is that it has the fleur-de-lis on it that you see here, and these upside down fleur-de-lis here. It was a part of her personal emblem that you see in her coat of arms here. And it's, again, a uniquely northern element. You don't see this in Spain at all. Certainly in France you do. For the Duchy of Burgundy, you see it, which is what effectively they were ruling. And of course you see it in Florence as well, unrelated. But this brings us to our two portraits of the Archdukes, painted by Pantoja de la Cruz in 1600. So again, right around the time that they are going to Belgium, what's modern day Belgium, painted in this style very reminiscent of the Spanish court, in a style developed by Antonis More, who is another Flemish painter who went to Spain and started creating these portraits done on this very black, stark background, which has its antecedents in the Netherlands. And it becomes the court tradition for the next 150 years, more or less. And so, as I mentioned, you had Moore, and then Coelho, and then Pantoja de la Cruz. And so you see this here. And they are girded up for battle, as it were. It looks as though they are both dressed in armor. He is actually in armor, of course. She's wearing the same dress that she was wearing in this previous image, but it's been darkened a little bit. So it's got this silvery sheen that looks very armorial. And this is how everyone from Spain went to the Netherlands. They went dressed to do battle, which they did, and they ruled with an iron fist, which was completely contrary to how these two are going to rule. So again, ironic, they're dressed in battle, and yet they come truly bringing peace. Albert is wearing this very fashionable armor from Milan. It was from a particular moment, 1590s to about 1610, that is damascened. It means it's covered with these gold. You have this kind of gold or multiple metal inlay that looks very much like the damask silk tapestries that we saw in a lot of these backgrounds. So very, very stylish. And Isabella, again, still has this cross on. She's still wearing this cross. She's still got the string of pearls. And then she's got this pearl here that has just really become part of the Spanish royal family. And then most significantly, this incredible lace collar. And if you look at this, this is all needle lace, which we'll look at in a moment, but it's all done by hand. And you can imagine the amount of work that went into this. The lace making industry, as I mentioned, was really starting at this time. It started really in Bruges with bobbin lacing. Oops, sorry. And I'll show you one of those. And then it went to what this is, which is needle lace. The flax that was grown in Flanders was exquisite. It was whiter, it was finer, it was stronger than anything grown elsewhere in Europe. Interestingly enough, that flax from the 16th and 17th century is no longer available. Pesticides have ruined it beyond making this fineness that they had. And so you've got, again, just this exquisite ruff that highlights both of their faces. So he accents their faces just with this whiteness here. Now, I just want to make a note about this jewel that I keep referencing, that we first see in this portrait that many of you are familiar with of Mary Tudor. And this is in fact sort of the entry point of this jewel into Spanish life and Spanish culture. It was a gift from Philip II to Mary upon their betrothal. And she has it set like this. It's also got a stone from Isabella of Portugal, Philip's mother. And then it's going to sort of make its way down the line through the Spanish queens. And ultimately 8 generations of Spanish queens are going to wear this. So we've got it here. We've got it in our portrait of Isabella. We have it in our portrait of Mariana in her hair here. And on this side, you've got sort of the bookend. This is a sketch, of course, in our collection by Velázquez of the Queen Mariana. And it'll come through. Now, ultimately, what happens to it, this is one of these rare jewels that actually makes it down through the ages. And it ends up going from Spain in the 19th century to France and then to England, where Richard Burton buys it in 1965 for his wife, Elizabeth Taylor. And it recently sold as part of her big auction of jewels for, I think, like $11 million. So you might have to look for it the next time it goes up for auction. But let's look at some of this lace. This is a bobbin-made lace bedspread. Can you imagine this spectacular craftsmanship that was done that has, depicts Archduke and Duchess right here in this bedspread. And again, took a tremendous amount of work. So here's the other interesting thing, is that by supporting these lace makers, Isabella is also supporting women-owned businesses, because who's making lace? It's women. So they are truly spreading the wealth throughout society and giving a lot of women a great deal of autonomy. Here, just to give you a visual of what this bobbin lacing looks like. This is how it's, to give you an example of how it differs. These have bobbins, as you can see, unlike what will make these ruffs, and that is needle lace. Now, clearly you need something more than just lace to make something like this stand up. So there were two inventions that really helped this along. The first one was the development of starch, which happened in the late 16th century, because by making almost a paste, using wheat, they could make this starch, which they could then mold to maintain the shape. These would often be put over wires and then again, sort of reinforced with starch. They also used what's known as a Goffering iron. So you can see this here on the left, which would have been used to, again, they would have put it into hot coals, into a fire, and they would have been able to just sort of slump and create this shape for these ruffs. And then here you get a detail of needle lace. So really quite labor intensive and really dangerous too. I mean, these women had to work in awful conditions to get to the flax to where it needed to be to create lace. I also brought one more image just to show you how this is Elizabethan and it's cotton, but how they would have sat. Now, here's the thing. After all that work and after all that time and all that energy, you could only wear these ruffs once, because between sweat, you know, and weather, they would start to droop after about an hour. So it took them forever to set. And then you would only be able to wear them for a short amount of time once, if you can imagine. And then I also wonder, when you look at something like this, how anybody would even been able to eat. I mean, I think this had to be ceremonial. You had to know it was hot and uncomfortable between the starch and the wires and the lace and whatever, and having it tight around your neck. It had to be misery to wear. Now, when the Archdukes got to Belgium, modern day Belgium, they became tremendous patrons of the arts. And here you see them in, again, another painting done by local artists, Jan Bruegel, the elder, not to be confused with Peter Bruegel, who did all those wonderful life scenes, but this is Jan Bruegel, known as the Velvet because he did, the surfaces are so gorgeous, and Hieronymus Franken III. This is a unique thing in Flemish painting, that they would do these collaborative, truly collaborative paintings where the strengths of one would be complemented by the other. And it's not the first time we see these. And so here you've got them, you see them sort of at the center of all of this, arts and culture, discovery, music, everything, decorative arts, really sort of all of this is radiating out from the Archdukes. And then you also see them with these gorgeous flowers. And what I love here is the sunflower, which came from South America, which was, of course, a Spanish territory, facing, even the sunflower is facing the Archdukes. And so they are truly the center of this universe. It's almost as if they are the sun. And in fact, Philip IV will refer to himself, you know, their nephew, as the sun god. And so in some ways, this really sets us up for Las Meninas, this idea of the world revolving around the Habsburgs that you see. Now, they also brought it, as I keep saying, a tremendous amount of peace. The minute that they got there, almost the minute they signed a truce with Great Britain, the Treaty of London, which was signed in 1604. In 1609, they signed the 12-year truce with the Netherlands, which allowed suddenly for agriculture to thrive and industry to thrive and all of these things that were unable to happen as long as they were at war. Luxury industry started to thrive. And so they played a really pivotal role. Now, what happened to them? What happened to their reign? Now, you may recall that as long as they had a child, that land would be theirs. Well, unfortunately, that wasn't the case. They had 3 children who did not make it out of childhood. And so when you see these 2 portraits by Peter Paul Rubens, you see a note of sadness, I think, on both of their faces. These are in the Prado. What I love about them, these are done in 1615. There's no armor here. There's a peaceful kingdom behind them. And so you've got Albert with his favorite palace, the Palace of Tervuren, which was the hunting lodge right near Brussels. And he was trying to create dynastic lineage here. This palace had belonged to the Dukes of Brabant, from the House of Burgundy. And so he was creating this lineage. There are also roses here. The roses, again, are Christian symbols. And then one other element that I want to point out are the gloves. Gloves were a gift of diplomacy in the 16th century. So his armor's gone, he's got gloves, a different kind of diplomacy. Isabella, for her part, has Marie Mont, her favorite palace. It was their summer retreat, which she had remodeled in the background. She's wearing this exquisite cut velvet dress with this image of the Virgin and Child. Not sure what is on this. I believe it's a treaty, though, would certainly make a lot of sense. And she's still got her handkerchief. And these, again, are also done by the two leading painters in the Spanish Netherlands, Peter Paul Rubens and Jan Bruegel. So this is this wonderful collaborative effort. In the background here, you see this peaceful kingdom with people and animals going around. The antecedent for this, I think, was a painting that Rubens probably saw the first time he was in Spain on a diplomatic mission for the court of the Gonzagas. And it was a painting by Titian of Charles V and Isabella of Portugal. And so here you see a very similar thing, this red cloth of state behind them, a landscape beyond them. And this one he painted in 1628. He painted it based on the painting by by Titian. And the reason why he was painting in 1628 is he had 10 months at the court. He was there on a diplomatic embassy for Isabella and saw this, and he had time to kind of cool his heels. So he's copying a lot of these works by Titian. Now, when this one is painted, you know, it's sort of the end of Albert's life. He will die in 1621. At this point, Isabella becomes the governor of the Spanish Netherlands on behalf of the King of Spain. And she rules on her own very capably. And who is her sort of right-hand man, confidant, diplomat, court artist? None other than Peter Paul Rubens. And she does what any Spanish noblewoman would do. She enters this noble order of the Sisters of St. Clair. She takes the habit, which I have mentioned to the docents, you've got to believe was far more comfortable than those earlier dresses that she was wearing. And she will ultimately move back to Spain, where she enters the convent of the Descalzes Reales, but not before she commissions first Rubens to do this suite of 20 tapestries that are then woven between 4 different workshops in Brussels. So even after she leaves, she's still supporting the Flemish economy and still sort of spreading her goodwill there. Even though the final break with Spain comes, of course, with the end of the Habsburg Empire in 1700, Isabella and Albert really left an indelible mark that benefited their subjects in Flanders as well as the Spanish crown. And it finally offered everybody a respite of peace in that often contested region. Thank you. I will be happy to take any questions at this point.
Thank you so much, Nancy. We already have one question in the chat box, but I just wanted to remind the group that you are welcome to share more questions in the chat box. If you'd like to turn your camera on and raise your hand, I can invite you to unmute and share your question with your own voice. Or a third option, if you'd like to unmute, you can always type a message in the chat box asking, and I'll let you know, and that way you don't have to turn your camera on if you'd prefer not to. Okay, our first question comes from Jean Felsted. So Nancy, do you know anything about the dynamics between the Archduke and Isabella? Did they get along? Was it a happy marriage?
I think it was. I think they did get along. I mean, I don't know. I don't have anything anecdotal, but you know, there are 20 million portraits of the two of them together. I think, you know, aside from the fact that they didn't have children to outlive them, they worked together. So I think as far as royal marriages went, it was a good one. And as far as I know, he was faithful to her, which is rare. And so it was, you know, I do think that they got along, and I do think that certainly by the metric of the time, it was a very happy marriage.
Thank you. I guess a question about something that they don't wear, about a fashion that we tend not to see. Terry is curious about crowns.
Yeah.
And
that is
whether Spanish royalty wear them or not.
I don't think they do. I think if I go back just to show you, you know, they wear a lot of, the men wear a lot of armor, that's for darn sure. And if we just look back, let me get this back up here for you, at, you know, the parents, they sort of, the women kind of wear these diadems that you can see here. But as far as an actual crown like they do in France, you don't really see a lot of them. And I don't know why. That's an excellent question.
Great.
I will look into it.
Thanks. So Larry is wondering, back to the ruffs, which I cannot believe how much work was put into something that had such an incredibly short shelf life. But Larry is curious about how they were actually put on. Do you know anything about kind of the dressing?
Yeah, so they tied in the back. They sort of opened up and they would be put on you kind of like a choker, and they tied in the back. And then they had this sort of bit of cloth that was built up so that they could, you know, have that little tilt to them. But yeah, you can find some. I think the Victoria and Albert Museum have some. And if you sort of do a Google search, some of them, I was trying to find one, but I couldn't find one from this time period. But they do have a tie on them.
Thank you. As of now, that's all the questions we have in the chat box. I'm just going to scroll through the gallery to see if anyone wanted to unmute. Okay, well, just a final comment, and this comes from Maria. She just wants to thank you for a wonderful presentation, and she would like to wish, and I think the Meadows Museum would also like to wish everyone a wonderful end of 2020, a great holiday in 2021, and look forward to kind of the new year that is to come. So thank you so very much, Nancy. It's been a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thank you all again, and happy, healthy holidays. And I look forward to seeing everyone in 2021.